When 6-year-old Mateo takes his first steps into the zoo, he's captivated by the idea of seeing lions, creatures he believes are the epitome of bravery. But what begins as a joyful family outing quickly turns sinister when Mateo is mysteriously pushed into the lion enclosure. His parents, Carlos and Elena, are frozen in horror as their son stands face to face with the lion, his innocent gaze meeting the animal's unblinking stare. As tensions rise, so does the haunting presence of Declan, a zoo employee whose gaze follows them with an unsettling intensity. With their son safe but traumatized, Carlos and Elena set out on a harrowing journey for justice, revealing a past connection that binds Declan to their family in unimaginable ways. As secrets unravel, the line between vengeance and justice blurs, challenging them to find the true meaning of courage and the power of forgiveness. Carlos watched as Mateo practically bounced in the back seat, clutching his stuffed lion. "Are we there yet, Papa?" Mateo's eyes were bright with excitement. "Almost," Carlos chuckled, glancing at Elena, who returned his smile. "He's been talking about the lions all morning." Elena turned to Mateo. "So, what's the first animal you want to see?" "Lions. They're the bravest, right?" Mateo's voice was full of admiration. Carlos parked the car, and Mateo bolted out, his small legs working double time. They held hands, walking through the entrance. Carlos couldn't shake the pride swelling in his chest. Today, he thought, was about creating memories, ones Mateo would carry with him forever. As they passed through the gates, a zoo employee named Declan eyed them with a cold stare. Carlos noticed, feeling the sudden tension in the air. Declan's gaze lingered a little too long, a slight frown creasing his face. "Something wrong?" Elena asked, sensing Carlos's unease. "It's probably nothing," Carlos muttered, watching Declan walk away. "Just that guy. The way he looked at us." Elena squeezed his hand. "Let's not let one bad look spoil Mateo's day, okay?" Carlos nodded, but couldn't fully shake the feeling. Still, he turned back to Mateo, who was tugging at his hand, his face eager and full of wonder. They moved forward, yet Carlos's mind remained slightly on edge. Mateo darted from exhibit to exhibit, pointing excitedly at colorful birds, curious reptiles, and sleepy koalas. His laughter echoed through the aviary as a bright blue parrot flew close to him, and Carlos found himself momentarily lost in his son's joy. "This is exactly what I wanted for him," he murmured to Elena. But as they moved toward the reptiles, Carlos spotted Declan again, lingering by the enclosure with an expression that was harder to read now. Was it anger? Disapproval? Carlos clenched his jaw, feeling an unease settling back over him. "Carlos, are you okay?" Elena asked, watching him closely. He forced a smile. "I'm fine. Let's keep going." But his gaze kept darting to where Declan had stood. Mateo, thankfully, was oblivious, too busy marveling at the massive python lounging behind the glass. "Look, Papa, lions." Mateo pressed his hands to the glass, his face awash in awe as he watched the massive creatures lounging in the sun. Carlos and Elena joined him, equally captivated, until Carlos caught sight of Declan, now standing closer, his gaze intense and unsettling. This time, Declan's expression carried a clear hostility, and Carlos felt a surge of anger rise within him. "What's his problem?" Carlos muttered under his breath. "Let's not do this here, Carlos," Elena whispered, sensing his growing frustration. "Mateo's loving this." Taking a deep breath, Carlos forced his attention back to Mateo, who was enthralled by a lion lifting its massive head, casting a slow, steady gaze right at him. It was a moment of beauty, but Declan's shadow made it feel fragile, as if one wrong move could shatter everything. As they were about to leave, Declan approached with an inscrutable look. Carlos tried to step forward, blocking him, but Declan moved past, his eyes fixed on Mateo. In an instant, Declan's hand pushed, sending Mateo stumbling forward toward the enclosure's low railing. "Mateo!" Elena screamed, reaching out as Mateo lost his balance. Carlos lunged, but it was too late. Mateo tumbled down into the enclosure, landing with a thud. Silence filled the space as the lion lifted its head, watching the small boy lying on the ground, bewildered and still. Carlos and Elena stood frozen in horror, their son's fate hanging by a thread as the beast approached. Mateo lay stunned on the dirt floor, his wide eyes blinking up at the towering lion slowly closing the distance between them. "Mateo!" Carlos shouted, his voice raw with fear. He and Elena pressed against the glass, desperate to reach their son. "Papa!" Mateo's small voice trembled, but he didn't move. Elena gripped Carlos's arm. "What do we do? He's too close to the lion. He can't even." "Carlos, he can't move." Carlos swallowed hard, barely able to breathe. "Stay still, Mateo," he called, hoping his voice could keep Mateo calm. As the lion inched closer, the gathered crowd held their breath, transfixed by the surreal and terrifying scene. The lion stopped just a few feet from Mateo, gazing down at him with unblinking eyes. Mateo stayed still, his eyes locked with the lion's as if they shared an understanding. He whispered, "I'm not afraid of you." Carlos and Elena, watching helplessly, felt a flicker of hope as the lion seemed to hesitate, crouching low instead of attacking. Is he okay?" Elena whispered, unable to look away. He's staying calm," Carlos said, his voice thick with awe. "It's like they're connecting somehow." The crowd murmured in disbelief, captivated by the calm between the boy and the beast. Carlos's heart pounded as he willed the moment to hold, praying it would be enough to keep Mateo safe. Carlos couldn't take it any longer. "I have to get him," he said, trying to climb over the railing, but a security guard pulled him back. "You can't. It's too dangerous." "Dangerous?" Carlos snapped, his voice thick with anger. "That's my son down there. He needs me." Elena clutched his arm, her own eyes wild. "Please, let them get Mateo out," she whispered, though every part of her wanted to run in, too. The security team assured them they were doing everything they could, but Carlos and Elena's patience was at its breaking point. Carlos turned to the guards, his voice choked with emotion. "If anything happens to him, if he doesn't make it out," he couldn't finish, his words dissolving into a plea. But his anger toward Declan simmered beneath the surface, vowing he wouldn't let this pass without consequence. Zoo's staff moved quickly, using a series of loud noises and distractions to lure the lion away. Carlos and Elena watched in anguish as a handler, trembling but determined, made his way toward Mateo. "Come on, just a little closer," Elena murmured, her hands pressed to her mouth in prayer. Mateo finally looked up as the handler extended his hand. "Come here, buddy," the handler said softly, coaxing him gently. Mateo crawled forward, and as soon as he was within reach, the handler scooped him up, backing away carefully as the crowd erupted into relieved applause. Carlos and Elena ran to meet them as they climbed back over the barrier. Carlos pulled Mateo into a tight hug, his own shoulders shaking with relief. You're okay, he whispered, pressing a kiss to his son's head as Elena held them both, tears streaming down her face. They left the zoo, Mateo held protectively between them, still dazed but unharmed. Once they were in the car, Elena turned to Carlos, her voice trembling. He could have. Carlos squeezed her hand, but he didn't. Mateo's safe. That's all that matters now. But that man, Declan, Elena said, her eyes flashing with anger. This wasn't just an accident. He pushed Mateo. He did this. Carlos's jaw tightened. We're not letting him get away with it. We'll make sure he answers for what he did. He looked at Mateo, sleeping in the back seat, and felt a surge of determination. They would seek justice, no matter how hard it would be. Carlos and Elena sat across from the zoo's manager, a middle-aged woman with a tight-lipped expression. We want to report what happened. Our son could have died because of Declan, Carlos said, his voice steady but laced with anger. The manager looked uncomfortable. I assure you, we take this very seriously. Declan has been suspended while we investigate. Elena leaned forward, her voice firm. Suspension isn't enough. He needs to be held accountable. What he did was intentional. The manager nodded, but her response felt hollow. We're cooperating with authorities. That's all I can say right now. As they left, Carlos turned to Elena. This isn't over. If they won't act, we'll make them. Later that day, Carlos's phone rang. It was a reporter. "Mr. Ortega, we heard about the incident with your son at the zoo. Would you be willing to share your story?" Carlos hesitated but glanced at Elena, who gave him a nod of encouragement. "Yes, we'll talk," he replied. That evening, they sat down for an interview, sharing Mateo's story with the world. "It's not just about our son," Elena told the camera. "We want to ensure no other family goes through this." The story hit the headlines, and the public responded with outrage, putting pressure on the zoo. Carlos and Elena felt a surge of hope as the media spotlight amplified their voices, pushing the zoo closer to accountability. A few days later, Carlos's friend, who worked in law enforcement, called. "Carlos, I did some digging. Declan has a history, complaints from other visitors, even a few staff." Carlos's jaw clenched. "So, they knew he was a problem and did nothing?" "It seems so," the friend confirmed. "This information might help you build a stronger case." Carlos shared the news with Elena, who was both horrified and resolute. "If they ignored this, they're just as responsible," she said. Knowing Declan's record strengthened their resolve, giving them a new angle for their fight. News of Declan's history quickly spread, and soon, community members began rallying behind Carlos and Elena. They attended a local town hall, where people spoke out in support. A neighbor approached them after the meeting, her voice shaky with emotion. "What happened to Mateo was unthinkable. We're all behind you." Carlos and Elena were deeply moved by the outpouring of support. "Thank you," Elena said, her voice choked. They realized they weren't alone. The community was with them, bolstering their courage and determination to continue their fight. Shortly after, the zoo issued a public statement. "Declan has been suspended, pending a thorough investigation," the director announced, her tone formal. But to Carlos and Elena, it felt like a half-hearted attempt to appease the public. "This isn't enough," Carlos said, clenching his fists as they watched the press conference on TV. "They need to take real responsibility." Elena nodded. "Then we'll take it further. We're pursuing legal action." Carlos and Elena sat across from Harold Green, their lawyer, in his modest office. "You have a strong case," Harold assured them. The zoo's negligence and Declan's actions created an unsafe environment for Mateo. Elena nodded, her expression resolute. "We want justice. We want Declan held accountable, and the zoo to take responsibility." Harold leaned forward. "We'll need to stay focused. It won't be easy. The zoo will try to downplay the incident as an accident." Carlos exchanged a glance with Elena, his hand tightening around hers. "We're ready for whatever it takes," he said, determination clear in his voice. They knew they were stepping into a challenging battle, but felt a renewed sense of purpose as they prepared for the trial ahead. In the courtroom, the zoo's defense attorney spoke smoothly. "This incident was a tragic accident. Declan was not directly responsible for Mateo's fall." Carlos clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "That man pushed my son," he whispered to Elena. "And now they're trying to dismiss it like it was nothing." Elena placed a comforting hand on his arm. "They're just trying to protect themselves. But we have the truth on our side." Harold rose to counter. "This was no accident. Declan had a history of aggression and was allowed to continue working without supervision. The zoo neglected their responsibility to ensure a safe environment." Carlos felt a surge of hope, watching the courtroom's reaction to Harold's words. Several community members took the stand to testify, each recounting instances of Declan's hostile behavior. One visitor described a confrontation they'd witnessed. "He seemed to take pleasure in intimidating families," the woman said, casting a quick look at Carlos and Elena. Another witness added, "I remember Declan watching them closely that day. It wasn't normal." Carlos felt a weight lift as he heard these stories. "People see the truth, Elena," he whispered. "They're standing with us." Elena nodded, her eyes misting with gratitude. "We're not alone in this," she replied softly, feeling the support of the community strengthening their case. Harold presented the evidence they had uncovered about Declan's history. "There are multiple complaints on file, yet the zoo ignored the warnings," he stated, holding up records. "This shows a pattern of aggression that the zoo chose to overlook." The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, attempting to object, but Harold pressed on. detailing each incident as the courtroom listened intently. Carlos watched as the expressions of the jury members shifted, their sympathy and shock apparent. Elena whispered, "This might actually change everything." Carlos nodded, sensing the tide turning in their favor. The truth was finally coming to light, and it was clear that Declan's actions were far from isolated incidents. As the trial neared its conclusion, a surprise witness came forward, a former employee who revealed a long-buried connection between Declan and Carlos's family. Declan blamed the Ortega family for something that happened years ago. The witness explained, a tense silence falling over the courtroom. Carlos exchanged a stunned glance with Elena. "So this wasn't random," he murmured, feeling the betrayal cut deeper than he'd imagined. Harold leaned toward them, his voice low. "This is crucial. It shows a motive behind Declan's actions." Carlos sat with his father, his hands clenched. "Dad, why didn't you tell me about Declan? That he held a grudge against our family?" His father sighed, looking away. "I didn't think it would ever come to this. Declan's family. They always blamed us for what happened in the past." "What happened?" Carlos pressed, feeling the weight of betrayal settle in. "It was an old business dispute. His father believed we cost him his livelihood, and Declan. He's carried that resentment ever since." His father's voice was filled with regret. Carlos felt a mix of anger and sadness. This wasn't just a random act. It was deeply personal, and that truth only fueled his determination to see justice done. That evening, Carlos and Elena dug deeper, determined to understand the full extent of Declan's animosity. They pieced together records, finding old complaints filed by Declan's father against Carlos's family. "So, this goes back decades," Elena murmured, shaking her head in disbelief. "But why hold on to it so tightly?" Carlos exhaled slowly. "Some people can't let go of the past. Declan's been poisoned by his father's bitterness." Elena touched his arm gently. "It doesn't excuse what he did. If anything, it shows how dangerous grudges can be. We're doing the right thing by making sure he faces consequences." Carlos nodded, feeling more resolute than ever. This was no longer just about Mateo. It was about righting wrongs that had festered for too long. At a community gathering, Carlos and Elena shared what they'd uncovered. Neighbors and supporters listened, shocked and moved by the depth of Declan's vendetta. "This isn't just about us," Carlos said, his voice strong. "It's about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter how old the grudges are." A community leader stepped forward, nodding. "We're behind you, Carlos. This has opened our eyes, and we'll stand by you to see justice through." The support emboldened them. Carlos felt a wave of gratitude and strength as he looked around the room. They weren't just fighting alone. Their community was with them, fueling their resolve to face whatever came next. In a mediated setting, Carlos finally came face to face with Declan. "Why?" Carlos asked, his voice steady but brimming with emotion. "Why put my son in danger over something that had nothing to do with him?" Declan's face twisted with a bitter smile. "Your family destroyed ours. My father lost everything because of you." Carlos shook his head. "My son had nothing to do with that. This grudge is yours, and it ends with you." Declan's bravado faltered, revealing a flicker of doubt, but his expression quickly hardened again. "We'll see." Carlos left the confrontation feeling a strange sense of closure, knowing he'd seen Declan's true nature. This man's bitterness would consume him, but Carlos was determined it would no longer impact his family. Back at home, Carlos and Elena reviewed their case with Harold, bracing themselves for the trial's conclusion. "You've done everything you could," Harold reassured them. "Now we wait for the court's decision." Carlos looked at Elena, who gave him a nod of encouragement. "No matter what happens, we stood up for Mateo. We showed him the importance of courage." Elena squeezed his hand. "And we showed him that we'll always fight for what's right." The family reflected on their journey, feeling an overwhelming sense of unity and resilience. They were ready to face the final judgment, knowing they had already won something far more important, the strength to stand up for each other. In the packed courtroom, Carlos and Elena held their breath as the judge's voice echoed through the room. After reviewing the evidence, it is the court's decision that Declan Morrow and the City Zoo are accountable for the harm caused. Elena squeezed Carlos's hand, relief flooding through her. "We did it," she whispered. Her voice choked with emotion. Carlos nodded, unable to speak as he glanced down at Mateo, who sat beside them, clutching his mother's hand. "We did this for you, Mateo. For your safety and for every child who deserves to feel safe." Mateo looked up with a small, brave smile, not fully understanding the verdict, but sensing the weight of the moment. Carlos and Elena shared a look of accomplishment. They had won a battle that meant everything to their family. Days after the verdict, the zoo held a press conference. The director spoke with a somber expression. "We deeply regret the incident involving young Mateo Ortega. Effective immediately, we're implementing comprehensive safety protocols and a strict vetting process for all employees." Watching the broadcast, Carlos nodded with satisfaction. It may have taken all of this, but they're finally making changes. Elena exhaled slowly, her relief mixing with a sense of closure. It's a start. They're acknowledging their responsibility, and that's more than we ever thought we'd get. They looked at each other, feeling the burden lifting as the zoo's public acknowledgement validated their efforts and the courage it had taken to get here. With the trial over, Carlos, Elena, and Mateo began therapy sessions as a family. During one session, the therapist asked Mateo, "How do you feel when you think about the zoo now?" Mateo thought for a moment before saying, "I was scared, but then I was brave. And Mama and Papa were brave too." Carlos smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, Mateo, we were all brave together." Elena leaned in, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "We went through something hard, but we're still here, stronger than before." The sessions helped them process the trauma, and little by little, their scars began to heal. Mateo's confidence returned, and Carlos and Elena found solace in the resilience of their family. One day, they received an invitation from the zoo director, inviting Mateo back as an honorary guest. "It might be good for him," Elena said, looking at Carlos, "to help him find closure." They returned to the zoo, and Mateo, now visibly calmer, led them back to the lion enclosure. This time, the barriers were higher, and additional staff members were stationed nearby. Mateo watched the lions, a peaceful look on his face. "I'm not scared anymore," he said, glancing up at his parents. "I think the lion knew I was brave." Carlos placed a hand on Mateo's shoulder, his own eyes filled with pride. "You were, Mateo, braver than I ever imagined." As they left the zoo, Carlos and Elena walked hand in hand with Mateo between them, feeling a renewed sense of peace. The ordeal had been long and painful, but they had emerged stronger and more united. In the car, Mateo looked out the window, his voice soft. "I want to help people one day, Papa, like you helped me." Carlos's throat tightened, and he glanced at Elena, who nodded with pride. "You already do, Mateo, and you always will." With smiles and a shared sense of purpose, they drove away from the zoo, ready to embrace whatever the future held, their bond unbreakable and their courage unshakable.